All right. I am here with John Washington, author of The Case for Open Borders, to talk about a subject which hasn't gotten a lot of play among the left, among liberals, or anywhere really outside of the Republican Party and the reactionary politics that respond to the Republican Party. And that is the question of immigration and what the left's affirmative, kind of ethical and rooted in left politics viewpoint on immigration should be. I know this is a tough subject area. It's part of why I've struggled for years now to get a guest to come on and talk honestly about how the left should be approaching this issue. So I'm very glad to be welcoming John Washington to the show. Welcome, John.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. So right off the bat, people are going to hear, okay, the case for open borders, and they're going to be looking at you on their little screen and wondering, why does this man want to end America as we know it?
Yeah. I'm not going to cop to that charge, but I don't think the fear is justified. Just go back a little bit into history, and you don't have to go very far back. And things along the U.S.-Mexico border, things with immigration policy were vastly different. ICE, the Immigration Enforcement Agency, has only been around since 2005. So we existed as a country for 95% of our entire history without ICE. The only real, substantive border infrastructure along the U.S.-Mexico border started being put up in the 1990s. And before that, we had, a number of different types of laws that tried to keep people out or targeted specific nationalities. But the situation was far different. For the first 100 years of this country's existence, there were zero federal immigration statutes on the book, zero. And we obviously were a country. You can look at not only in the history, but you look at other examples across the world of what are relatively open borders, not completely open borders, but relatively so. And countries exist, they thrive, both culturally, economically, and in all ways that a country can really thrive. I mean, the easiest example to reach to is the EU. And after they opened up free migration within the EU, while simultaneously fortifying it around the rim of the European Union, what didn't happen was a rush to migrate. In fact, there's some studies that show some of the people from Eastern Europe, where actually my family's Romanian, they didn't go across in larger numbers than before they were actually came into the EU. And, right now you look at France, and France is still pretty French. Spain is still pretty Spanish. Culturally, it hasn't been a problem. Cultures do change, and there are various threats to cultures, or maybe we don't have to even think of them as threats, but just ways that they are modified or just constantly in flux. But that really doesn't have that much to do with migration. It might have some effect, but, especially in these behemoth nation states like the United States with 300 some million people, folks come and they assimilate. And it is something that does happen. There has always been a fear of it not happening, and that's really just a way to scapegoat some sort of other. And you can go back and you can watch this pattern repeated over and over and over again. First, it was the Irish, and then the German, the Chinese, then the Mexican, and you could go on and on and on about who are the next people who are blamed for whatever problems are existing at the time, who are scapegoated, who are pushed back, who are restricted in their mobility. And yet, right now, especially those earlier, I mean, of course, racism against many of those cultures still exist, but in large part, they have actually become part of this American project or experiment. So I think that the threat is actually completely overblown, or rather more than that, even just completely fabricated.
So there are people on the left who might say, well, my concern is not one of these nativist concerns about the identity of America as a, let's say, white Christian nation or otherwise defined in a way that we're very invested in culturally and don't want to change to be more other, but rather that as a leftist, I understand that lax immigration policies have been favored historically by right-leaning folks and by libertarian folks as a way to drive down labor power. Temporary work programs and the like are weaponized against the domestic labor population. And that as a leftist, while I have compassion and sympathy for people who are making tough border crossings, disagree with American foreign policy that has created conditions in their countries of origin that have caused them to need to flee for economic or violence related reasons, all of those things. But at the end of the day, I don't want to have open borders because I don't want to contribute to the further immiseration of the working class. That has to be my fundamental priority here. How would you address that concern?
Yeah, so those are just bad economics. That's not how it works. There is not a fixed number of jobs in an economy, especially in a national economy. What happens is that jobs pretty much beget jobs. So we have so many studies to lean on about this. And if you talk to any serious economist, there are a couple exceptions, but any serious economist knows and understands that actually immigration, even high levels of immigration, and even very rapid high levels of immigration, actually don't hurt economies. And then you can kind of drill down a little bit more and say, like, okay, well, maybe overall the economy would be better, but who's going to be benefiting? It's probably going to be the elite, the upper class, whatever. But actually, that's not only the case. That is the case. There is, typically an increase in like corporate profits, but there is also an increase in, or a zero change or a slight increase in wages for the lower sector workers. So a couple case studies we could look at. There's one really important one for all people who study immigration, especially for immigration economists. And it's in 1980, the Mariel boatlift, when in a little bit more than 6 months, about 170,000 or so Cubans landed in Miami. And there has been so much talked about this issue for the last 40 plus years, but study after study after study show that you can look at the narrowest sector of the economy, like high school dropout men between 18 and 24. And they may have like experienced no change in their wages. Whereas almost every other sector has actually benefited from the rapid increase in migration. The people who benefited the most in many of those cases were the people who are actually migrating. And it's funny that almost all the economic studies only look at the effects on the native workers, not the effects on the people who are actually migrating itself. It's, I think, very telling in the way that we talk about migration. We talk about like, how's it going to affect us? But of course, that leaves out half of the equation is how is it going to affect the people who are actually migrated? And for them, it was overwhelmingly positive. The reaction, wasn't perfect. A lot of those people were shipped to basically prison camps, but the people who were actually allowed to go into the workforce and work, what they did is they added to the economy. They paid taxes, they got jobs that were needed, and they, then created jobs because they, wanted to find a place to live. They went to shop for groceries. They did all the things that people do, which need more workers for. And so what happens when you have this large influx into economies or into workforces is you don't have to divide up the pie into smaller and smaller slices. The pie actually just kind of grows. And so, that's one big example. But you look at many different places across the world with even more rapid and larger moments of migration, and the same thing. And you see that actually the wages weren't really negatively affected. If at all, they were positively affected. Sorry, go on.
I take your point. Well, let's come back to some of those other examples in a second, but I take your point about the indifference that this research has toward the fate of the immigrant as opposed to the native population. And you open your book with this really compelling narrative about how you and your experience growing up and living near the southern border had this encounter where you encountered somebody who had done an illegal border crossing, and they were clearly in distress, and you were on your way to a camping trip with your friend, and in a moment of kind of shock and confusion, chose to what, you gave him some water and oranges, but didn't give him a ride. And then once you got to your destination, you and your friend kind of like jolted each other out of the kind of, I don't know, confusion, and went back to see if you could find him and help him, and weren't able to do so. But what's so compelling about that story is the extent to which we are trained and indoctrinated into a sense of different expectations for different people depending on their national origin, whether or not we feel like we're violating a law, regardless of our own kind of moral precepts, and how disappointed kind of you were in yourself in that moment, and how it made you really kind of reevaluate our relationship to non-Americans, to immigrants, and what it is, why it is that we have this idea that certain rights and privileges should extend in the first place on the basis of these arbitrary lines that were drawn by some guy long ago on a map. And so I find that to all be very compelling and persuasive. At the same time, there is this kind of political reality that I'm wrestling with, where the reason it seems to me that so much of the research is focused on whether or not immigration has a negative effect on the domestic population is because people want to be able to make an argument for or against immigration based on the people who are able to vote for or against immigration policies in the United States, and that is the native population. And so I am wanting to drill down on this Cuba example for one, because you bring in the research of, what's his name, George Borjas, who I've come across before. As again, I've been trying to do this episode for a long time, and his research is of note because he's one of the few immigration researchers, statisticians, whatever you want to call it, who has gotten a somewhat different result, and who has ascertained a negative effect, economic effect on domestic populations from immigration, concentrated in the kind of most vulnerable, lowest economic tranche of American worker. Am I putting that correctly?
That is what he found, but there was economists that followed on his heels and actually found some flaws in his argument.
So talk to me about those flaws. Why shouldn't I be concerned about Borjas? Because it seemed even in your book that you write in this section about the economic argument for open borders, that Black people in Miami saw their wages increase while non-Cuban Hispanics saw their wages remain steady. The only group that saw a slight decrease in wages, according to CARD, were other Cubans who had already been living in Miami. So that already one is, all right, it's not nothing. Other Cubans living in Miami. I understand that there's winners and losers in policies, and maybe we decide we're going to address those losers in another way, which you get to, and we can come back to this idea of keyhole solutions for discrete groups that are losers. But also you go on to say that unemployment numbers follow the same trend, remaining steady or slightly rising over the 5 years following the arrival of the Marielitos, with one exception. The Black unemployment rate more than doubled from 1979 to 1983. But within the next 2 years, it dropped back down to lower than it had been before. So I want you to give me an opportunity to kind of speak to why we shouldn't be concerned about even those numbers that were validated by this other researcher, CARD, not just Borjas.
So when, I think if I'm remembering the numbers correctly right now, Borjas pointed out that small segment of the population, which was, I think it was black young male workers. And CARD, when he went back and looked at Borjas' data, found that I think that particular segment of the population in Miami was like a few dozen people. It was really small. Mm. I don't want to minimize, what happened to those few dozen people, because that's something. But I think that as a society, as a city, as a community, we could probably do something else. And I think that they also, especially Black young men in 1980 in Miami, probably were dealing with a lot of other problems as well. And maybe those should be addressed. And one of the reasons, and you mentioned that number, I think it's really important to just kind of make sure this is clear, is that at first the unemployment rate did jump. The unemployment rate did jump. immediately after the Marielitos came for, again, Black young Miamians. But that was actually because they were counted in a different way. They were actually left out of some of the demographic censuses before that. And then they were added in. And that is why their unemployment numbers jumped, because they had been unemployed. They just weren't even counted before that. So this was like a correction that needed to be made anyway, but it kind of skewed the numbers. And so, yeah, the keyhole solution here is like anytime there's a major change in policy, there's going to be some winners and losers. I think, though, sticking with this example, overwhelmingly, there were winners and there were some losers. And I think that that is something that is the reality of living in larger communities. And we can address those losses, or we can address those, grievances that inevitably will come up. But I think that to use that as sort of like a canard to say, like, well, look, this was all bad, when obviously it wasn't for so many other sectors of the population, which are, just counting numbers, which is what, when you're playing big level politics, is sort of what you have to do. And it just, everything else tilts towards this being a positive.
Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of wanted to address some of what you were saying before that too, about, this approach to thinking through only the effects on Native workers, and that anecdote that I start the book with when I decided not to fully help this young man I came across.
Yeah.
I did leave him by the side of the road. I don't know what happened to him. Hopefully he made it, and he's fine now, but there's a chance he didn't. And I think that it's really telling that someone who, this is a much younger me at this point, where I thought I was, a humane person living in this world, someone who like cared about others and was sympathetic, and would see a someone suffering and try to help and meet those needs. And yet I didn't, or I only partially did, because just the logic of bordering had gotten so deep in my psyche that I was scared for me in that situation. Whereas what was on the line for this man was life or death. What was on the line for me was breaking some rule that actually makes very little moral or ethical sense. And so, like, when you think about like this, just the reality of it in those basic terms, I think it does sort of, at least for me, it makes me think like, wow, like how are we okay with this? How are we okay with this system of basically global apartheid, where we have different laws for different people? Some people, because of where they were born, through no merit of their own, and this passport that they have, can travel the world as they please, and others are restricted or locked down into places of very intense precarity or persecution. Or just in the United States right now, we are creating what is a permanent, or maybe at least semi-permanent, underclass of residents. Like, how are we okay with that? Like, why is that okay? Like, this most recent border bill that was proposed by the Senate had zero legalization terms in it. Zero. And this was a bipartisan bill. And so what we're going to do is actually just maintain the status quo, and actually probably grow it, because of the way that we're going to further crack down. We're going to incentivize further unauthorized migration, and have yet more people, yet more millions of people probably, enter into a country and be living here without any legal status. And that is, we know that they're here, and there's no way to get rid of them. So we're just going to be like, okay, like, yeah, there's going to be a few million, or a few dozen million, perhaps, people who just like have no, like, do not have the same protections of the law. Like, just in those terms, like, how is that possibly okay? Like, why is the left not up in arms with that?
What it feels like people are saying is that, well, Obama was the deporter in chief. My understanding is that Biden has deported even more people than that. Republicans obviously are emphasizing the historic number of border crossings, but it's also true that there's a historic number of deportations. And it does seem like, whether tacitly or explicitly, the solution to what you're describing from in a bipartisan way, but from the Biden administration, is that we will, this a bill that doesn't have more avenues for naturalization. It doesn't result in more immigrants because we are ramping up mass deportations. Does that? I mean, how are you reading this?
Well, here's one of the things I really try to do with the book is try to understand what borders do and what they don't do. And what they don't do is stop people from migrating. We have decades, I think, like half a century of experience throughout the world showing that immigration crackdowns, border walls, border militarization doesn't stop people from migrating. It just doesn't. There are so many different ways you can look at it, and we can pick a couple examples here in the United States. So right now, the percentage of foreign-born population is about 15% in the United States. 100 years ago, it was about 15%. That 15% now is a far greater number just because our population has grown. That period is also the period where we saw just, decade after decade after decade of different attempts to try to stop people from migrating, try to deport people, do these mass deportations. Like some of the worst examples in, recent history of immigration policy. And what did it do? Nothing. Or look at the foreign-born population from Latin America over the past 40 years. So in 1980, it was under 5 million people. Today, it's 30-some million people. Most of the border enforcement measures have been along the southern border, and throughout most of that history, it was really targeting Mexicans and some Central Americans. And yet, what happened? The population grew enormously. Let me give just a couple of quick international examples as well as Brexit. Brexit was premised on this idea that the EU is driving migration to the UK, that being part of this, national collective was incentivizing people to come to the UK and steal all these benefits, which wasn't happening. It was premised on a lie. But what happened after they finally enacted Brexit, which took years, in the 2 years immediately subsequent to pulling out of the EU, more migrants went to the UK. Everywhere you look, you see that actually deterrence doesn't work. Walls don't work. They change how people migrate, but they don't stop people from migrating. I'm going to give one more example because this I think is really important, is the family separation policy, which I covered extensively. My first book, in large part, was a lot about the family separation policy. I got to know very well a father who tried multiple times, was separated from his 5-year-old daughter. He didn't know where she was for about 2 months. Lifelong trauma. He tried again. We saw the numbers of people who tried to cross in family units after the implementation of the zero tolerance policy in spring of 2018 go up. The most, inhumane, draconian, just absolutely heartless policy you can imagine. And it didn't stop people from trying to migrate. They were migrating for a reason. So deterrence doesn't work. So maybe we should think of another approach. We could think about, one, how to welcome people because they're going to make it anyway, and how to treat them once they're here. And also consider why they're migrating. And that is, there's a lot to talk about there, but it's something that I think gets only, if at all, superficially addressed.
It's interesting because while I'm frankly, to put my cards on the table, I would like to say, yes, I'm an open borders advocate. That's my inclination, but to want to address some of the fundamental, I think, not illegitimate concerns by, in particular, poor and working class Americans about whether or not they're the ones that are going to have to bear the burdens of change. There's winners and losers in every change, and I think that is worth talking about. But I got to say, the argument about incentives, I need a little bit more persuading. I definitely see the argument, and the numbers bear out, that creating draconian conditions for immigrants is not going to stop immigration. That doesn't seem to be exactly the same thing, though, as saying if the conditions are ideal. Like if we started a safe, well air-conditioned van service that would pick people up from one side of the Mexico border and bring them into America and settle them in nice hotels. Maybe that's what we should have. But it seems to me obvious that the easier that process becomes, the more people are going to take advantage of it, as well they should, right? So it seems to me that there has to be some acknowledgement that there is, at least on the margins, a deterrent effect. Even if we say the same thing with crime, right? Having stricter penalties for crimes, longer jail sentences, capital punishment doesn't seem to have an effect on the commission of crime. But also, if I knew that I could waltz into, Best Buy and get myself some earbuds and waltz out, and the worst thing that could ever happen to me was like a $20 fine, then heck, I might just give it a go. You know what I mean? Like, so I don't know. Do I sound like I'm being crazy to you? Like, is it? I mean, here's maybe there's a way for me to answer this in a more ask this in a more pointed way. Conservatives accuse Biden of causing the spike in immigration and border crossing rates that happened around 2001 because he is a Democrat who telegraphed that the border is open. I don't believe that to be the case. But to what do you attribute the sharp rise in immigration levels around that time?
I will answer that question in a second. Though I don't. I mean, I think no one really exactly knows. I mean, we're undergoing. I'll start by answering it rather. We're undergoing a period of mass global displacement for a number of different reasons. Climate change is a huge one. Ongoing extractive capitalism is another one. And that is something that really isn't addressed by border and immigration politics. It's just not. I mean, people are moving, and sort of what I was answering for the last one is like they're going to find a way to move. That is a fundamental, I think, inherent part of being human, is fleeing privation and persecution, and that's the reality that we're seeing in the world right now. Where they move and the patterns, flows about how they move does change. I think that policies do affect that. And, the United States has been this large draw for people throughout the world for a long time. And, a lot of it, I think, boils down to the economy. A lot of it also boils down to the meddling that the United States continues to do in many, many foreign countries. I mean, how many foreign military bases are there does the United States have? It's, hundreds and hundreds on every continent. How many places are U.S. corporations, using actually the border as sort of a lever to benefit from wage differentials, workers' rights differentials, things like that. So, the United States and many other, countries of the global north have more or less an open borders policy in which they are going to many of the countries that people are fleeing, and they are benefiting from the conditions there. And so, yeah, that is one of the major causes of why people are leaving. And that's another one of the reasons that people are leaving and going to where they are going to. So Europe and the United States. I think that is actually much more of the cause than any sort of signaling that Biden or Kamala Harris does. I mean, Kamala Harris, infamously went to Guatemala and said, "Stay at home, stay at home.
Do not come."
Do not. That's right. Do not come.
Yeah.
Do not come. There's like this very dramatic pause between the two.
I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come. The United States will continue to enforce our laws and secure our border. There are legal methods by which migration can and should occur. But we, as one of our priorities, will discourage illegal migration. And I believe if you come to our border, you will be turned back.
The repetition there. And just like, I mean, that actually means nothing when the conditions are in place to drive people to go and to drive people go where they're going. You can wag your finger at them. But one other really important part of this is what you were asking in your question is, I don't think if we had these air-conditioned bus transports that you're suggesting, or had zero consequences, as you were mentioning too, if it's only a slap on the wrist, I don't think it would spur enormous levels of mass migration. There would probably be an uptick, but we can just kind of look at some of the patterns that we see now and understand where people are migrating to and how they're migrating, and understand that they probably wouldn't like exponentially, the levels of migration wouldn't exponentially increase if we open the borders throughout the world. And another important part of this,
because I could argue with myself right now, and I can see it already. One thing about my example that I use is that I'm not a person in need, and the people who are already in a situation of desperation or economic precarity where they're already stealing from the Best Buy, like in my example, are not on the margin edge case like me, who has no incentive to steal from the Best Buy because I can buy my own earbuds. Or to your point that you make in the book, there exists a kind of open borders depending what kind of passport you have already. So here I am, I'm an American. There's nothing really precluding me from moving to many other places in the world, and yet I choose not to because there's not any need for me to. I'm economically satisfied here. This is where my family is. This is where my culture is. This is where I live. Now, I have lived overseas for many years in my youth. And frankly, the conditions were such that my parents benefited economically from doing so. So that kind of the test case in both directions. But for most Americans, that's not a desire because we feel like we have the better end of the stick here. And that's the fundamental issue, is whether or not people have conditions all over the world where they can choose to stay where most people would prefer to stay, which is in their own communities.
right? So a couple figures here that I think would help maybe ease some of the concern is right now, and this is especially for Europeans who are implementing more and more creative or creatively just tyrannical crackdowns, is 90% of all African refugees are currently in Africa. And that's because most people leave their country in Africa and they go to the neighboring country in Africa because there are cultural, family, and economic ties there, or because it's expensive to move. And it's emotionally exhausting to move, especially to a completely different culture. So most people who do migrate, most international migrants overwhelmingly throughout the world, move to a very nearby country. We see it in this hemisphere as well. So right now, the biggest increase, one of the biggest increases in nationalities who are crossing the U.S.-Mexico border right now is Venezuelans. I think only an eighth of all Venezuelans who have left in the past couple of years are in the United States. Most of them are in Colombia and Peru, and some, scattered in a couple other Latin American countries. They are not trying to all come to the United States. They're not, people, migrants in Africa and in Asia are not all trying to go to Europe or Australia. That's just not the case. And we just have to also bring into the conversation, and, we've touched on it just briefly, but, what are the conditions that are driving people to flee? And you cannot just open the borders and think that's magically everything's going to be better. I think it would be, well, I think they would be better, but it's not going to be solved. And I think that one of the major issues here too, and this is maybe my next book, not really, but just like, well, then what do we do to sort of create the conditions where people do not have to leave? And this is like the right to stay, the right to remain. That has to be with the corollary here to the right to migrate, the right to stay. And right now, I think that is almost, or maybe even more restricted than the right to move for much of the global South.
I mean, the discussion about the climate crisis and climate refugees, I think, is part of what's driven me to want to think really seriously about the ethics of borders in the first place. Because climate is one of those things where, for collective action reasons, for industrialization pattern reasons, the parts of the world that are suffering the most in terms of the consequences of it are not the parts of the world that have contributed the most to the catastrophe. The ethics of sitting here in the United States of America that happens through the just fate and dumb luck to have, the largest body of freshwater lakes in the world and all of the resources that we have. And to say you cannot come Kamala Harris style when our consumption habits have substantially contributed to a drought in X, Y, and Z place. when you talk in the book about the kinds of economic arrangements that the global north has forced on much of the rest of the world, um, uh, that incentivize the global south countries to grow products for export that are exotic and consumed by the north, depressing their ability to cultivate food for themselves, having to rely on imports from Europe, all of these kinds of trends that exacerbate drought and famine and things like that in the global south. When you look at all of the ways that Europeans and colonialism have created these conditions, it becomes it's obviously deeply unethical to have some border guard lined up and said, you have to die on the other side of this line because of something that, frankly, I did or my country did. I don't see any way around that. And that's why, regardless of what argument I think is legitimately made by a working class person who has concerns about what the implications for them will be on an individual level, and I love that you point this out, how the kind of immigration debate de-individualizes people and forces you to detach from that individual that you saw on the road and have felt an impulse to help, at least in some way, to this idea that, well, it's going to be too many. There's not enough room. And you run through a number of these, I don't want to call them excuses, but a number of the arguments that people who argue against open borders use and how to push back against them. So I want you to kind of speak to that a little bit, if you could. I mean, I think that ethically, the argument for open borders is entirely there. And my concern is just, how do you get people to say, I'm willing to personally suffer, even if in the abstract and ethically and morally, I understand that there but for the grace of God go I, and that this border is artificial, and that this border is being used to exacerbate inequalities and exploit the other for my own gain. Am I going to be the one that opens the door and willingly lets go of those advantages?
Yeah. There's a lot there. To start, I think, considering climate change, what is the end game? So I'm relying on some statistics from the Transnational Institute that came out last year that the United States, over a recent 5-year period, spent 11 times more on border enforcement than it did in climate change mitigation. And so when we know that people are forced to flee because of climate change, I have done a lot of reporting in Central America, and you can see the effects firsthand. I mean, devastating storms, years-long droughts. And we try to block those people off. Like, how does that play out in the near term? Like, so people don't have food. They don't have enough food. They can't, rely on their traditional ways of cultivating whatever. They are living in a state of increasing authoritarianism, and we try to lock them in. We try to just wall them off. So then what? Then they just slowly starve. Then they just or maybe it becomes this political powder keg, and they finally break out. There's another war. There's a civil war. There's a revolution. How does that actually play out? I mean, we've actually kind of tried that a number of times in Central America, and it hasn't played out very well. And what we have seen is increased migration. And again, mentioning some of the deterrence, the failures of deterrence that we've talked about a couple of times, it's you actually can't do it. So why are we spending so much money trying to do it? And then shifting a little bit to this idea of this ethical issue, I think before even we get to the ethics of trying to close the inequality gaps that exist, that are obscene throughout the world, I think it's also important to point out that I think a lot of the people maybe listening and maybe who have these concerns, they actually won't see very much of the effects. As I said, study after study shows that actually it doesn't bottom out your wages, and it doesn't lead to more unemployment. And we've actually seen counter studies where there's been examples even in times of extreme economic downturn, like downturn, like after the Great Depression, when there were crackdowns. So in 1932, I believe it was, the Mexican Repatriation Act was passed, where they tried to round up a lot of the Mexican workers and deport them back because American workers were struggling so hard. And the places that they were most deported from actually suffered more economically because they didn't have people shopping in the stores. They didn't have people working in the fields as they needed to. I mean, this was in a period where that was the majority of the work that was being done in some of the studies, like in the Plain States. So what we see there is actually the opposite effect. So I think that the concern isn't nearly as valid as I think a lot of people think it is. And then, yeah, you're relying on ethics. I mean, maybe we will have to stomach some change. I want to put that a little differently. We must, address this insane, or as I said a second ago, like obscene, gap in basic living standards throughout the world that is predicated upon our current system. Like, this is not okay. And I think that this needs to be addressed. And one of the ways to do it is to allow people to sort of, find their own way and home and make sure that it's stable and go somewhere else if need be. And also just make sure that home where they are currently is not preyed upon by, the corporate elite.
I mean, to that point, there are folks who bring up the fact that Bernie Sanders once got dinged for criticizing open borders on the basis that it was like a Koch brothers plan or desire to have open borders because of its labor suppression effects.
Something that is in what you said about being a democratic socialist is a more international view. But I think if you take global poverty that seriously, it leads you to conclusions that in the US are considered out of political bounds. Things like sharply raising the level of immigration we permit, even up to a level of open borders, about sharply increasing the amount of foreign aid. Open borders.
That's a Koch brothers proposal. The
Really?
idea, of course, I mean, that's a right-wing proposal which says essentially there is no United States.
But it would make a lot of the
me.
global poor richer, wouldn't it?
And it'd make everybody in America poor. Then you're doing away with the concept of a nation state. And I don't think there's any country in the world which believes in that. If you believe in a nation state, or in a country called the United States, or UK, or Denmark, or any other country, you have an obligation, in my view, to do everything we can to help poor people. What right-wing people in this country would love is an open border policy. Bring in all kinds of people who work for $2 or $3 an hour. That would be great for them. I don't believe in that. I think we have to raise wages in this country. I think we have to do everything that we can to create the millions of jobs. You know what youth unemployment in the United States of America today? If you're white, a white kid, high school graduate, 33%, a Hispanic, 36%, African American, 51%. You think we should open the borders and bring in a lot of low-wage workers? Or do you think maybe we should try to get jobs for those kids? So I think from a moral responsibility, we've got to work with the rest of the industrialized world to address the problems of international poverty, but you don't do that by making people in this country even poorer.
So then what are the responsibilities we have? If that kind of zero-sum calculation, right, between someone who is poor by US standards, but is quite well off by, say, Malaysian standards, redounds so easily to the benefit of the person in the US, and how do we think about that responsibility? I guess I'm asking here I agree, you have a nation-state structure. You always are going to. The politics don't allow anything else. But I guess philosophically the question is, how do you weight it? How do you think about what the foreign aid budget would be? How do you think about poverty abroad?
And I'll tell you why. Well, first of all, again, as a United States Senator from Vermont, my first obligation, frankly, is to make certain that kids in my state and kids all over this country have the ability to go to college, which is why I am supporting tuition-free public colleges and universities. I believe we should create millions of jobs rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure and ask the wealthiest people in this country to start paying their fair share of taxes. I believe we should raise the minimum wage to at least $15 an hour so people in this country are not living in poverty. And I think we end the disgrace of some 20% of our kids living in poverty in America. Now, how do you do that? What you do that is understand there's been a huge redistribution of wealth in the last 30 years from the middle class to the top 1/10 of 1%. Now, the other thing that you understand globally is you have horrendous imbalance in terms of wealth in the world. As I mentioned earlier, the top 1% will own more than the bottom 99% in a year or so. That's absurd. And that takes you to programs like the IMF and so forth and so on. But I think what we need to be doing as a global economy is making sure that people in poor countries have decent paying jobs, have education, have health care, have nutrition for their people. That is a moral responsibility. But you don't do that, as some would suggest, by lowering the standard of American workers, which has already gone down very significantly.
And how do you repeatedly in the book take care to point out that, as you're making an economic argument, you shouldn't ignore the moral argument. And the argument here isn't to say that just because the economy is better when immigrants are there, that immigrants should be exploited as a consequence. But how do you guard against that? I mean, how does someone on the left make the argument for open borders without falling into what might be described as a Koch brothers plot to suppress labor power?
Well, I think there's a labor argument to be made too. I mean, I sort of already mentioned like the border acting as like a lever or like a fulcrum by which corporations can benefit from wage differentials. One of the other things that they benefit from is labor rights differentials. So worker protections in northern Mexico in the maquila industry are minimal, if they exist at all. I mean, I've reported on and visited some of these places, and they're bad working conditions, and people are underpaid, and that is because of the border. Like, if the border didn't exist, that wouldn't be the case, because people could move to places where they had higher wages or they had better worker protections. And then what would happen to those factories? They would be like, oh, well, we're losing all of our workers, so we have to, raise, basic safety standards or whatever. Justin Akers Chacon, he published a great book last year, maybe 2 years ago now, The Border Crossed Us. I mean, he is a Marxist labor scholar, and he gets really deep into the weeds on all of this. And he shows how there's been a decline, a relative decline in wages in a lot of these Mexican factories. There has been even more than the United States, a decline in unionization rates, and then all the worker standards that come from declining unionization rates. And if it weren't for the border, that wouldn't be the case. Like, that is created, those gaps are created because of the border. So what we can do is, if we knock down those walls, and I mean that, figuratively, then from a labor perspective, we will actually be extending rights to these people. We'll be able to create border solidarity. I mean, think about what happened after NAFTA. I grew up in Ohio, and the steel yard, which is where my grandfather actually, after moving from Romania, got a job at a steel factory. The steel yard in Cleveland is now a stupid Target, Home Depot, and Cineplex. And it used to be a steel plant. And that is now in Mexico because of the rise of free trade agreements, along with the locking down of the border. And those two run in parallel. Also, Justin Akers Chacon, he counts, and that was a couple of years old, so I recounted. There's about 400 free trade agreements throughout the world, according to the World Trade Organization, and this is harder to track, but Chacon counted about 40 of those 400 that have any sort of free labor provisions. And those are for highly specialized jobs. So what we have here is this ability for capital and goods to go wherever it makes sense for them to go, but people are immobilized. Or rather, some people are immobilized. So I think from the left, I think it's really a good labor argument to open the borders.
I didn't realize you were a Buckeye.
Yes. Yeah, partially. I went 1 year at OU, the rival of the Buckeyes. So,
sorry, I didn't mean like literally. I just mean generally from Cleveland. Are you referring to is it the flats that you're referring to that used to be a steel mill down there where they have all those restaurants and?
No, I don't know what that was, except the place where the Cuyahoga River burned in like the early 80s.
Right.
That might have also been an industrial place, but that was, at least in all of my life, it's just been like a, mediocre series of restaurants. Maybe it's gotten better now. I haven't been in a while. Yeah.
Yeah, no, mediocre series of restaurants in like a Tommy Bahama, I think is right. No,
Yeah.
Margaritaville.
Dick's,
Margaritaville's down,
something. Yeah.
down there. Guys, I sing the praises of Cleveland off on this show. Don't take this as a dismissal of the great
Wait, are you from Cleveland?
On the water. Sorry?
You're from Cleveland?
My mom's family is all from Cleveland.
Oh, cool.
Yes.
Yeah.
We just had
great.
a Citizenship episode, so we were talking Cleveland, and I know this audience has gotten an earful for me, and it's like, move on already. Nobody's moving to Ohio.
Yeah.
But I tried. It's got a lot of fresh water, guys. The climate crisis is coming.
It does. Yeah.
I'm really fascinated by some of the more historical narratives you weave into this book, where you trace kind of the evolution of our contemporary understanding of what borders even are, and talking about various colonial efforts in Australia or in North America, obviously, or in Africa, and how convenient sort of it is that colonists had no conception of borders whatsoever. And only at the sort of end of the colonial era does it become important to establish these ideas of national sovereignty and the immutability of borders after you've already parceled up the world between all of them. And the relative prevalence of straight lines on borders in Africa as compared to other parts of the world as evidence of this sort of arbitrary way that countries were carved up by people looking at maps who had never been anywhere near the areas that they were deciding upon. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that. How do we come to this kind of more contemporary understanding of borders and the immutability of borders that we have now?
Mm-hmm. I mean, so borders are always shifting. You look at the United States border, it has shifted, as of relatively recently with, the addition of a couple new states in the middle of last century. What happened really, though, in the beginning of the 20th century was this new conception of trying to really more clearly define what a country was. And that was after World War II. And that was also followed the introduction of the passport for the first time in history. And yet, some scholars that I read and found really illuminating, including Mahmoud Mandani, he writes about that the origin of the nation state actually, traditionally, a lot of people understood it as the end of the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, whereas you start trying to identify territorial integrity in a different way, and you move from this idea of kingdom to something like idea of a nation state. But Mahmoud Mandani talks about it. He puts the date at 1492, when we saw colonialists for the first time start to subjugate and try to just exploit and extract from faraway colonies and try to carve up their own spaces. So the fight between the Spanish, the French, the Portuguese, and the Dutch was really when they had to start just organizing themselves in the quote unquote new world. And that was when the first time that they had these proto-modern borders, or the beginnings of what could be understood as a nation state, really start forming. But he and others too also point out the fallacy or the impossibility of that is, these territories are not homogenous at all. And so, but that is what the idea of a nation state is. So, a state is this organizing principle of governance, and the nation is this idea that these people embody these similar characteristics that is, culminated into nationhood. But look at any country in the world, even right now, or even, 50 years ago before more recent migration trends, and no country was homogenous at all. I mean, there's some that are sort of outlying, maybe some island nations have a little bit of that. But truly, the idea of a nation state is exclusionary. And when you trace the forming of any country, and I'll give two quick examples here. One is Indonesia, and Benedict Anderson in his book, which has been really important for a lot of people studying this, Imagined Communities, showed how the formation of this idea of a country of Indonesia, which is literally thousands of different islands with incredibly diverse languages, cultures, ethnicities, whatever, they had to figure out some like bordering technique. So they just said, like, well, this island is part of Indonesia and this island isn't. When you look at those two islands that are next geographically very close to each other, and they share a lot of similarities to people living on them, and yet all of a sudden there's this, fictional border, or this, juridical border between them, and you have to like supposedly separate or put some distance between these two people. Whereas, Indonesia is also a very large country. The people on this distant island are somehow tied to people on an island 1,000 miles away. And so, like, you have to create this thing. It's not a inherent or natural organizing tool. It is something that takes a lot of effort and actually takes, in almost every example in history, a lot of violence. The United States, too. I mean, look at the origins of the United States. Like, people, I think, on the right, or a very easy analogy that people go to, and I think it's a fallacious one, is, well, this idea of a country is like a home, and you need to lock your doors at night, for example. It's like, okay, the country actually is not at all like a home, but let's just go with that for a second. Did you buy your home from someone who was a willing seller? Was it like a fair contract that, of two like consenting parties? Because that's not what happened here. What happened is the people came in and they murdered, committed genocidal slaughter, or just forcibly removed the people who were living here, and then all of a sudden feel like they have the right to lock the door. Like, that is like putting it in sort of like, slightly juvenile terms, but it's like, yeah, this nation state as we see it today in the United States was created by those extraordinarily violent means. And now to worry about this idea of the cohesion of the nation states, like, wait, what is going on? And also, of course, just the incredible diversity that we have in the United States. I mean, someone traveling from South Texas to wherever, the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, or, Boston to Tucson, where I am right now. It's like you cross so many different boundaries and so many different changing cultures and languages and cuisines and everything. And yet somehow we have this idea that we're all part of the same thing, which can be, seems to be like, oh, maybe it's not that big of a deal. But then we see what it results in, like what happens when we try to tie each other together in this forced way, which necessarily implies some sort of exclusion, which we see obviously along the Mexico border, which is, 50 miles south of here.
Yeah, it can go both ways, right? I mean, I hear what you're saying, but it also is the case that for better or for worse, I do feel a kind of solidarity with affection for relationship to other Americans, regardless of our diversity. When you encounter other Americans overseas, I think a lot of us have experienced that feeling of suddenly, hearing the familiar voice in the room and it putting a smile on your face and wanting to talk shop with, oh, you went to UCLA, like that experience happens. Growing up overseas, I would find myself shocked at how I would end up defending America in all of these situations because some Belgian girl had some nonsense to say and I felt like I had to put her in her place or whatever, But it also works the other way. And I think when you're writing about these cities on the border, but for the border and before border politics were enforced, were one contiguous city with people traveling back and forth all the time and family members living on both sides of the aisle, suddenly having certain kind of economic conditions imposed because of the border. It's interesting, but the other part of it is, how do you define in a democracy where groups of people are deciding on federal leadership, less local leadership, big ticket leadership, and policy decisions that have to be decided on a mass level as opposed to local politics? Who decides who's able to make those decisions, who's able to vote, and who is subject to the laws that are then promulgated without those kinds of borderlines? Who are we responsible to and who's responsible for us in a world where there are no borders at all. But, still different governments. Are we saying that we're living in kind of a Star Trek future one global government? I mean, like, what is that? Talk me through what that starts to look and feel like.
So I think that this is, one of the reasons I really wanted to put this book out there is to try to clarify some of these things. And I think that is look, let's say you're on board a little bit, but then you play it out a little bit more. You're like, oh, but then, how do we know who's in, what's going on? Like, who's going to be part of this community? What I'm trying to clarify here is open borders, not no borders. And so I think that there is some organizational necessity to defining your state. But I don't think it needs to be based on nationality. And, and I think that there are some relatively benign or even like positive things to nationality as well. Like, I mean, I'm not completely against it. I also grew up very nationalistic from a family who migrated fleeing communism. I mean, it was pretty intense in my household. But, I think that having some way to decide like who is part of the social fabric makes a lot of sense. But it could be open. I think right now, one of the other huge criticisms of our current bordering regime is that we don't know who's coming into the country. And that's true, because what walls and what deterrence measures do is force people to try to sneak across the border. But if we had open borders and required people to pass through ports of entry and registered folks, we would know exactly who's coming into our country. They could actually pay into taxes. They could become more contributing members to the society. We wouldn't have a tiered society as we have right now. I've also written about this idea of non-citizen voting. And, this too, I think it's occasionally strikes me that we have fought so hard some people have fought so hard for voting rights in the United States. And yet we have here currently a permanent population of people who have no say in the people who govern them. Like, how is that okay? Like, I know I've used that as a refrain a couple of times, but it just seems to be just contrary to a lot of the basic left principles that we should have a say in who governs us. And, I think that there are common sense ways to kind of think through, maybe people don't get to vote right away. And they have to establish residency and live in a place for a few years or something. There are some places that actually follow those guidelines, but also with welfare benefits. Newcomers are not eligible for welfare benefits immediately. And they pay into the pot for a long time. But what happens when you have a permanently undocumented or people in this, what the term of art is like a twilight status, something that is going to run out, or they're going to be forced into, the black market, is all they are able to do is pay into the pot. And who, I think that just no one really, when you think about it like that, they only have to pay in, but they get to take zero benefits. Again, what sort of society do we want? If that's...
And I think you make that point really well in the book, looking at the numbers of how much immigrants, undocumented immigrants, contribute to the social safety net without being able to take advantage of those benefits that they pay into, is a really strong point to make. I do want you to weigh in more pointedly on the bipartisan immigration bill, if you could. I've seen, obviously, immigration advocates, including people who, frankly, seem to have drifted away from the left they once represented themselves as part of in recent years, come out and say how frustrated they are with Biden's immigration bill. People like Beto O'Rourke, where's he been? He's back.
Yeah, right.
Or Julian Castro, for instance. And it does seem like there's an effort by the Biden administration to pander to absolutely no one. I mean, there's no one on the left who seems to be appeased by this. This is purely an effort to get the right on board with a foreign aid package, and he's willing to give away the farm, apparently. But have you taken a look at it? What's in it? Is there anything in it that would help to remedy the backlog with respect to immigration law judges, adjudicating asylum claims, those kinds of things? And what's the kind of cost benefit compared with some of the bad stuff, the perhaps funding of ICE, the continuation of Trump era policies and the like?
Yeah, so, starting sort of broadly, this is a tactic that the left has used for a long time, or rather the Democrats have used for a long time, try to play tough on the border in order to build political capital so they can pass a bipartisan immigration reform package. It didn't happen in 2013, though Obama, as you mentioned, was, already earned the moniker of deporter in chief at that point, and they didn't get it passed. 2007, pretty similar dynamic. 2024, again, we're not able to do it. So you would think that the Democrats would have learned their lesson and be like, so playing in or conceding to the right's demands on border immigration politics doesn't actually get us the votes to pass the reform bill. But we haven't learned that lesson, obviously. So what was actually in the bill? It wasn't all horrible. I mean, there were some things that were actually seemed to be moving in a positive direction, but overall, I think it was pretty bad. Some of the positive things were it was going to afford for the first time representation to immigrant children. That would be federally funded representation. Right now, immigrants do not get
the right to counsel.
Right. Immigrants do not have the right to counsel. It would also have increased the number of immigration judges and asylum officers. Those are three things that we need right now that would be absolutely positive. It also was going to raise the threshold for establishing an asylum claim, which is the opposite of what we need right now. We need to think about how asylum claims or asylum should be offered to people fleeing climate change, at least. And also just think about who we're offering asylum to, because it's always been a political issue. I mentioned this was pretty much what my first book was about. Right now, Mexicans have an asylum grant rate of, I think it's about 4%. To consider that people fleeing, really intense, paramilitary organizations in different parts of Mexico can't find asylum here is just a contradiction in terms. Like that is exactly what asylum is built for, and yet we're not giving it. So if anything, we need to lower the threshold. And then there.
Can I ask Can I ask about that? Because some people might be thinking maybe the volume of claimants is higher from Mexico than other places, and you're getting a different kind of skewed ratio of people who might be making a more pointed claim that satisfies the asylum law requirements. I'm fleeing political prosecution, discrimination on the basis of my religion or race or sexual orientation, all of those things, versus someone who, I would argue, has the right to cross a border, but is making more of a broader economic claim. I'm poor and I want a better quality of life in the United States of America. Is that what's going on here? Or, what's the evidence that some of the disparities that we're seeing between countries aren't really about the level of crime or the level of persecution that exists in various places based on the laws, prejudices, religious constraints, et cetera, that exist in those countries?
Very fair point. It is hard to kind of try to understand those numbers because each asylum claim is adjudicated on an individual basis. So you can't look at every single asylum claim for Mexico, but you can, I think, extrapolate something from the numbers. And I'll get into it in 1 second, but I also want to mention, fleeing sexual-based violence is actually not a category for gaining asylum. There's some case law that, points judges towards giving it, but it's definitely not the case across the board. And I think that that's another major one that should be part of a valid asylum claim. But, just looking historically at the evidence of who's claiming asylum and who's getting asylum, we see that it is, we give asylum to people fleeing states that we are not friendly with. If we're friendly with a state like Mexico, like the more oppressive regimes in Central America, especially in the 80s and 90s, we were able to give them asylum. But if we are friendly with them, here's just to put a finer point on that, like people fleeing Nicaragua in the 80s and 90s were granted asylum at far higher rates than people fleeing El Salvador and Guatemala, because we were backing the Salvadoran and Guatemalan regimes, and we were, in more or less like a proxy war with Nicaragua. And you see that like with Mexico, to say that the Mexican state is oppressing its people, is persecuting its people, or is not able to keep them safe. Those are like the basic grounds for granting asylum, would be a pretty sharp dig at Mexico, who we rely on for immigration policy to actually enact a lot of our immigration policies. So it really is a political game. It comes down to individual judges or asylum officers as well, and those, especially the judges, are appointed by the executive branch. So it's hard to boil down to a overarching conclusion, but you just look at the evidence and you see what happens. You see just like people from Mexico, despite, really like 300,000 some deaths in the last less than 20 years in Mexico, 115,000 at least disappearances, and we're giving 4% or so grant rates. To me, something there just kind of doesn't add up. I think you had another question there that I may have lost the thread on.
Yeah, it's okay though, because I did want to ask you also just about the border policy, the bipartisan border bill.
Yeah.
Republicans are making a lot of hay out of the idea that it was open borders basically until daily immigration rates hit a certain number, at which point a set of more restrictive policies would kick in. And I just wanted you to speak to that. What exactly did the bill say? And what's the truth behind what that kind of like switch is all about?
Yeah. Oh, God, this is just, it's so galling. You're on the border, you see what's going on, or you just like read the words in a law, and then you see people interpret them like that is just like 180 degrees contrary to their definition. It's really frustrating. You had actually the head of the Border Patrol Union, Brandon Judd, go on Fox News to try to clarify that 5,000 trigger number. And what it was is that after at least 5,000 people are crossing a day, after it reaches 5,000 or so people crossing a day, that is when immediate expulsion authority would be granted to Border Patrol. So until then, it would be what's happening now, not necessarily letting them in, but vetting them, processing them. And then what happens currently is a couple different things. One is that they are screened, given a court date, and released on their own recognizance. Another is that they are held in Border Patrol facilities for far longer than the statutory guidelines, which is 72 hours. They're held for like 10 to 14 days in miserable conditions, and they're given a initial fear screening there, which unsurprisingly they don't typically pass because they don't have easy access to counsel, and because the conditions are just so trying and traumatizing that then they're deported, or they're sent to ICE detention, which is a little bit different, but they can be held for much longer, up to potentially years, and their asylum claim will play out while they're being detained, which also has its own set of problems. So it would be what is happening now, but just when the numbers hit 5,000, then they would be given immediate expulsion authority, where they could just push them back into Mexico if Mexico's willing. And this is also goes to our last topic of conversation here, is like, we're dependent on Mexico in large part for our current bordering practices. So if Mexico is not willing to take someone who's not Mexican, what do we do with them? That is a huge part of the problem with a lot of the people coming from states that are not in the Latin America right now, is Mexico is not willing to take people from Africa. So we couldn't push them back under Title 42. Sometimes we still did, but Mexico tried to put the kibosh on that, and they have through these like State Department negotiations, they've been willing to accept in recent years Nicaraguans, people from Central America, some countries in Central America, sometimes Haitians, but not always, sometimes Cubans, but not always. And it's just always changing. So, the law was also predicated on this assumption that Mexico be willing to take back a lot of these people, which I don't think that's a fair assumption to make.
So the law basically says that once the border crossings exceed 5,000 a day, we get rid of our asylum laws, is what it's really saying.
Exactly. And we've had, since at least 2018, we have had something in place to not allow for our signed agreement to the UN Refugee Convention. So that 2018 started the Remain in Mexico policy. Then there was Title 42. Then there is currently, both of those have been rescinded, but they're, immediately replacing Title 42 was Biden administration's asylum restrictions, which most of the people who are released into the country right now, after they cross the border in the desert or through the Rio Grande, they actually are not eligible for asylum. They're eligible for some other lesser status, which would never lead to citizenship. So again, we keep on kind of touching on different ways that people are sort of entered into this multi-tiered, a society that we're living in. They're not going to get asylum because it's barred from them. And those are the statutes on the books. And some scholars, and ACLU is suing them about this, but a number of scholars say, well, this actually contradicts U.S. and international law, this current regulation. It's not a law. It's just a policy that
Wait,
Biden...
Help me understand, who are the people who are in the Gen Pop, who are just out on their own reconnaissance but aren't eligible for asylum? And what is their status if they're not eligible for asylum and they're not being deported? What is, even from an anti-immigrant administration's perspective, what's the goal of them being in limbo like that?
So there are, with the goal of them being in limbo, I think,
like, why not just deport them? I mean, like, if you're the Biden administration and or you're the deporter in chief, why are some people being told basically there's no path? I presume also no pathway to citizenship, no asylum, but we're also not going to deport you. What is going on there?
Well, so like I'll walk through it, and I'll do it quickly too. So people who cross the border without inspection, so not at ports of entry right now, unless they have some exceptional circumstance that drove them to do that, which very few people can get, they are detained by the Border Patrol. They are quickly vetted, and a lot of them, not all of them, because there's a couple different things that can happen, but a lot of them are given a notice to appear in court, and it's often months or even more often years down the road. So that does not make them eligible for asylum because of the regulations in effect right now. They can apply for status through Convention Against Torture or something called withholding of removal. These are really stupid terms and ways that we these categories that we have in the immigration world. But neither of those lead to have any paths towards citizenship. They prevent you from being deported, but they can also be revoked. And they also don't let you engage in family reunification. So if you have family outside of the country and you want to help them get into the country, if you have only CAT, Convention Against Torture, or withholding of removal, you can't apply for a family visa.
It does sound like what you're saying is pointing toward even kind of anti-immigrant politicians feeling like they should have a lot of incentive to want to fund administrative law judges, because it does seem like a significant chunk of the folks are just awaiting judgment, and the judgment is likely to be negative for them and frankly cause them to have to go back, which is some place for us to be fighting. But generally speaking, everybody should be wanting there to be quicker judgments. We're pushing for the judgments to be more positive. They're pushing for the judgments to be more negative. But am I wrong here? Why not more focus on funding
Exactly.
and speeding up the administrative process?
The backlog right now is over 3.2 million people, the immigration law backlog. So, I think you're exactly right. We have just our knee-jerk reaction to immigration is to militarize, is to surge more Border Patrol agents, is to build more detention centers, is to build soft-sided facilities, is to build more border wall, which, by the way, Biden is doing right now in Arizona. He claimed not another foot many times during the campaign and even in office, but he's building more border wall.
Right. And didn't he get, fast track or basically go around some environmental regulation to make sure that the wall could go faster?
Yeah, if you followed the law, you could not build a border because it is environmentally devastating. But that is where we're spending our money. We're not spending our money in immigration courts, in asylum officers, in immigration judges. If we were, we'd be able to adjudicate those claims for lesser forms of protection much more quickly. And then if this is where the administration wanted to go, they could then potentially deport them. I mean, that's not my suggestion, but they could. But they can't right now because they just don't have the capacity.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating. I really appreciate you weighing in on that, John. And the last thing I want to ask you about, because I don't think we can do a border episode without talking about Gaza, is to ask to what extent you've been thinking about that in that context. I mean, when we're talking about sort of the formalization of our contemporary concepts of borders at this sort of end of a colonial era, it has often struck me as interesting and perhaps the reason why it's such a conflict zone. That the establishment of the state of Israel seems to have come just right after we were done doing the colonialism. Like they just kind of missed its window, the last kind of new outpost to be created. And that has sort of led to some of these problems where maybe in the past there would have been more carte blanche to simply ethnically cleanse the pre-existing population, the way that happened in Australia and the United States and in so many places around the world without there being any national, global political outcry. But now we have a situation where you have groups of Palestinians in non-contiguous areas that are being denied the right to self-determination, largely because of the U.S. veto in the UN, where the rest of the world would happily recognize them as a state, and which is obviously undergoing right now a siege in which 30,000 people plus have died. How are you thinking about borders and how borders affect the viable positive outcomes for the people of Palestine right now?
I think what's happening in Gaza, we're seeing just the most volatile, violent ramifications of bordering logic. People are locked in to a relatively small area and they're being besieged and slaughtered, and the border walls are standing. I recently reconnected with a friend who I made after reporting on his journey escaping Gaza I think it was in 2015. And he was held in an immigration detention center in Arizona and for over a year. And the reason he was held for so long is because the United States was trying to deport him, but couldn't write the word Palestine on an official government document.
Are you serious?
Because we don't recognize the country of Palestine. And so they tried to deport him to Israel. Israel's like, no, I'm not going to take him. They tried to deport him to Jordan. There's like, no, what? And they held him. He was traveling with a friend also from Gaza. And, I got to know them both, reporting on them, and eventually became friends with them and have been in touch with them ever since. And he eventually got out after his attorneys hustled very hard and followed a habeas case and was able to get him out. He finally got asylum, amazingly. He has an ID card right now that says that he was born in Jordan, a country he's never been to, because again, the United States will not put the word Palestine on an official document. He is struggling right now to get his family out of Gaza. They have been displaced multiple times from the north. They are in Rafah, trying to get out, and they know how to do it. They need to raise $30-some thousand. They can pay an Egyptian fixer, and they will get them out. $30,000 to save the life of two people. I mean, in what we're seeing right now is the border in its most stark and anti-humanitarian, anti-human reality. People are making money off of people fleeing for their lives. I mean, this is, maybe not the most consequential thing, but it just like sometimes like that point jumps out at me, like who is charging for this? And yet, of course, these are the kind of secondary industries that get cultivated when you're literally slaughtering people and yet locking them in. And, there's a number of other case studies I look at in the book where people are, run up against the wall and they are, consigned to death because of this willingness to maintain this fictional idea of territorial integrity or something. And, this is to not even mention like all of the other things that you nodded to briefly about the rise of the state of Israel and the initial mass displacement and, artificial creation of these territories, of these like legal territories as they are right now. But yeah, I think it's in some sense, exemplifies just the absolute worst of what bordering logic entails.
I mean, this came up in an interview I did with Dean Phillips recently when we were kind of debating this issue, but it does seem to me, I mean, it's not a novel thought, but the tension that arises stems from a desire to have a state that is explicitly religious. So we're having this conversation about a kind of the, you know, who's controlled, who the border's defining who is controlled and who gets to vote. The who gets the vote aspect of it seems to be really key here, right? Because when you have a country established as a Jewish homeland, borders are very open and permeable to allow Jewish people from the diaspora, many of whom have just survived the horror of the Holocaust, completely understandably from an ethical perspective and a moral perspective, but the borders are open to allow immigration in that context, but requiring the demographic engineering to prevent the Arab majority and the surrounding areas from being equal participants in the state in a way that would threaten the religious identity of a country is at the core of this debate and at the core of why the Biden administration's commitment to a two-state solution seems to be little more than pablum and lip service, because it doesn't get to this fundamental question of how you can have a nation that is in some way contiguous and in some way isn't constantly being undermined and seen as a threat because of the demographic realities of the area that you live in, and how the borders are always going to be essential to a country like Israel as long as it sees itself and is determined to define itself in these kind of ethno-religious terms. It's making me not feel very positive about borders these days, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
John.
One of the ways that I've been thinking about it recently is, I ended my little spiel about the current conditions of bordering around Gaza with calling it a legal fiction. A border is a charade, but a charade with consequences. It's like a theater, but using live rounds in the guns. Like, because they have consequence. Like, we can say like, oh, it's this fictional idea to draw this borderline right here. Or it's this concept of saying, oh, this invasion along our southern border, or this using the term like military-aged men. Like, all of it is bullshit. But the bullshit has effects. And you see those effects right now, either in Gaza, people stuck running up against the wall, trying to jump up the funds to live, or along the U.S.-Mexico border, people currently right now, like where I am, like hiding from the Border Patrol in the desert and, subject to extreme temperatures and everything. Like, these are the effects of that. Or the way that we talk about the supposed evasion, and you send down these like militia wingnuts who come and endanger people's lives. You can't talk about this without recognizing that actually these policies will affect people. And like all of the border bill stuff that we talked about, like, where was the thought, or where were the interviews when they were covering this with the migrants? Like, no one did that. No one looked at what this would actually do to people. It was all looking towards, I mean, came into very sharp relief after the border bill was shot down, but it was just a political game. Like, it's all about, the campaign and working towards November, when, on either side, what you're after is just trying to win some votes. And yet the shit like actually has effects on human beings. And I think, sadly, tragically, that's somehow forgotten.
Yeah, it's interesting being on a show like Rising, that the left-right show, and understanding that the audience is really invested in an American first kind of politics, sometimes I can use that to my favor, right? Like, I don't think the United States should be funding Israel. Great. If you want to frame that as an American first issue, if we want to talk about how those tax dollars could be spent canceling medical debt or paying down student debt or, funding education, I don't really care. I'm happy to make that argument. But this is that pernicious aspect of nationality and morally, ethically. While I can see a government's argument as to why they have a responsibility to its people first, ethically, as a human being, I cannot buy into a kind of politics that says an American life is more vital, important, essential than a Nicaraguan life or a Palestinian life or whoever's on the other side of a border. And yeah, go ahead.
No, it has effects on Americans too. Down here, there are interior checkpoints that Americans have to pass through. You can't go to Nogales. You can't go to a number of other small towns in southern Arizona or different parts of New Mexico, Texas, Southern California without passing through checkpoints. You see this huge buildup of infrastructure along the border that is really just decimating the ecosystems that affects Americans, that affects native-born Americans. Like it also really impinges upon the freedoms of people here as well. I mean, it's not like there's no effect on us either.
And isn't there a new one of these laws that's just been promulgated, like the one that was in Arizona back in 2012, that allowed cops to basically racially profile you if they thought that you were an immigrant?
Yeah, so there's two bills, SB 4 in Texas, and then there's a bill, I can't remember the number, in Arizona that was actually just vetoed last night.
Oh, great. Excellent. Well, dodge that bullet, I guess.
Yeah. Our Democratic governor vetoed the bill, but SB 1070 is partially still in effect, actually. That's the bill you're talking about. It was passed in 2010. But SB 4 right now has been, I think, it's like a triple negative. It was enjoined, and then an injunction was enjoined, and then the injunction on the injunction was joined. So right now it's not in effect until like a couple of weeks from now when the Supreme Court's going to hear it. But yeah, it would just enable law enforcement to local law enforcement to enforce federal immigration statutes, which is contrary to centuries of immigration law. But, Abbott's just like throwing everything at the wall and seeing what's sticking. So we'll see what happens. I mean, with the Supreme Court, we'll see.
Yeah, you'll have to come back. I'd love to see you on Rising to talk through some of the stuff too. We're always looking for great immigration experts. I'm really grateful to you for joining me here today, John Washington, and I strongly encourage folks to pick up a copy of The Case for Open Borders, which just came out about a month ago, you were saying?
Yeah, just a month old. And I'll be in New York and DC in a week or so to do some readings and whatnot.
Okay, terrific. And I strongly recommend it also because the last chapter has a great kind of cheat sheet, which is 21 arguments for open borders that goes through in a really quick and incisive way the kinds of pushback that you're likely to get and what the counter arguments are. Immigrants don't steal jobs, they create them. Immigrants don't drain government coffers. Borders don't stop crime and violence, they engender crime and violence. And so it's really useful for people who are interested in messaging and how to win an argument, which I know is a lot of you in the crowd. So thank you again, John, and let people know where they can find you on the internet and beyond.
Yeah, Twitter or whatnot, at JB Washing. I write for a local new outlet called Arizona Luminaria. I'm on all the places, all the things, so you could find me. And what a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for having me on.
The pleasure is all mine. And thank you to all of you listeners. If you want an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week, you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast and find said episode on Monday. And also a clip of those episodes can be found on Bad Faith YouTube if you want a taste of what you're missing in those episodes. Take care of yourselves and keep the faith. Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.